It is. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this seminar. This is a seminar jointly sponsored by the Maine Sustainability Solutions Initiative, the School of Economics, and I also want to acknowledge my co-host for our guest speaker, Chris Furt from the University of New England in the Wells Reserve. We are very lucky today to have Robert Johnston visiting us from Clark University. Those of us in the room that are an active part of the SSI initiative, you will see from Rob's talk that Rob is very much a kindred scholar. He is an economist who has done work throughout the U.S., throughout the globe, doing economic research to generate information to inform a variety of public policy decisions. And we're really lucky to have him here today. At Clark University, Rob is a professor in the Department of Economics, but he is also the director of the George Perkins Marsh Institute. I believe, was that a home of yours, Bob, during your time at Clark?
I still have a title.
Okay, so we have this yet another link back to SSI.
In fact, Bob was one of the founders of the Marsh Institute.
Okay. I could spend lots of time telling amazing things about Rob. I printed his Vita off as I left the office yesterday. This is a double-sided copy, so linking knowledge with action, this will be my proof, but if you do take the time to go to his webpage, you will see a very productive scholar, someone who excels in terms of grants, in terms of publications, but he has also notably received both teaching and service awards. I've had the pleasure of serving with him in some organizations, and he's just a great colleague. So with that, I'll ask him to come up here.
I'll have to pay Kathleen nicely for saying all those nice things. Kathleen also knows that I have a lot of trouble standing still, so I'm going to try to stay vaguely behind the lectern, but I probably won't do very well. These are some nice pictures. Like this is obviously coastal flooding. This is a cooling water intake structure, right? This is where water goes through in before entering a power plant. So that's why those pictures are there. So today I'm going to be talking about specifically ecosystem service valuation, or how economists try to calculate the value of changes in nature. But more specifically, I'm going to be talking about how and why these things are relevant, right? Why would anybody bother, and what kind of policy decisions these things can influence. So, a little bit of background, right? So when you think about ecosystem services, right? I mean, basically it's kind of jargony, right? But really what we're talking about is how nature benefits people, right? That's really it. I mean, so how do changes in nature affect people in ways that we can measure? So when we talk about economic valuation of ecosystem services, all we're doing is trying to quantify the benefits that people receive from natural ecosystems, right? And these things and for economists, this is nothing new, right? It's basically just the idea that counter to what you might read in the media, people benefit from natural production, in quotes, exactly the same way that they benefit from the production of something you'd make in a human factory. And so to an economist, it makes perfect sense to try to balance those things, right? If you're balancing human activities that would use up or develop or degrade natural assets, it makes perfect sense to balance the costs of those with the benefits that one gets from those natural assets left or conserved in a more natural way, right? And so really that's all we're talking about with economic valuation, is trying to balance the benefits that we receive from nature with the benefits that we receive through human actions or human production. Right? And what we do as economists is try to provide some rigor to that. So we're comparing apples and apples, right? I mean, anybody can come up with a made-up number and say, oh, the world is worth $1 bazillion, right? And that doesn't really help us with anything. As economists, we're trying to come up with the theory and models which allow us to meaningfully compare the benefits that we receive from natural assets and natural flows with the benefits we receive from the things that we produce, little red wagons and milk and cars and things like that. So economists have been doing this for a long time, right? I mean, so those of you, those of you who happen to be called economists, I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing, but for basically for about 4 or 5 decades, we've been developing methods to measure various types of market and non-market benefits. And by non-market benefits, we're just talking about any sort of human benefit that's received through a product that you can't directly buy in markets, right? I can't go and buy species preservation at Walmart, right? So, but any benefit I receive is a non-market benefit. What makes the ecosystem services framework different is a more holistic perspective. So we're looking both at the ecological production side of things, the natural science or the biophysical science side, as well as the economic value side of things. So when we talk about ecosystem services, what kind of things are we talking about? Okay, we might be talking about pollination of crops, although this guy's pollinating a dandelion, but we won't tell anybody that. So the resulting agricultural production, climate mediation, specific products that you might buy and sell or use for subsequent human production, like timber and fish. Recreational resources, species that you might value because you simply value their preservation or because you want to go see them. Happy koala in Australia. Biodiversity, which can benefit us in various ways, flood protection, water purification. This is just some nice pictures I got, but there's a whole lot of different ways that ecosystems benefit us. The trick as economists is tracing those back specifically to how each change influences different people in different ways, so we make sure that we're measuring those values once and only once. One of the big challenges with ecosystems is there's all sorts of complexity, and figuring out how that complexity affects people. All right. So, for example, if you talk about climate, it's not necessarily climate that benefits us directly, or even backing out to carbon sequestration. It's the things that climate affects in many cases. And so that's often the challenge, is tracing things through the ecological system, through the social system, to figure out those points where human welfare is measurably influenced. And that's often a lot harder than it might seem. So why do we care? I mean, a lot of times people say, well, economic values, it doesn't matter, right? Why do we bother? We're looking to change action, right? And so here's some examples of direct policy relevance, why we can care. So ecosystem service values, or broadly non-market and market values, are a central part of cost-benefit analysis, and that's required for major federal actions under Executive Order 12866, and also specifically under individual statutes. So we have to measure benefits and costs. If you don't measure ecosystem service benefits, they get ignored. They get zeroed out, right? And all of a sudden, we've got a very lopsided benefit-cost analysis that tends to favor development and using up natural assets rather than protecting them. They're also a major component of natural resource damage assessments, and what those are, for those of you who may not know, when you damage the environment, say through an oil or a chemical spill, say the Gulf Deepwater Horizon spill, all sorts of oil. Well, natural resource damage assessment is where we try to calculate what those benefits are, so that we can decide, well, how much does BP have to compensate society, right? Ecosystem service values and non-market values are a major component of that, often the majority component of that. 2001, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the PCAST report, specifically calls for consideration of ecosystem service values by federal agencies. They have to do this, right? So, for example, now agencies that historically didn't want to have anything to do with ecosystem service values, now they have to do it, and they're struggling right now to figure out how to integrate these. So this is directly relevant to agencies, for example, like the Forest Service, that historically just managed for timber. Then they moved over to multiple use, and now explicitly they're having to somehow incorporate ecosystem services and values into that, and it's not always an easy task. If you're talking about developing potential markets or payments for ecosystem services, well, one of the things you have to understand is how ecosystem services benefit people and how you might develop those markets, right? If you don't understand that, you're probably going to get your markets wrong, right? And so on an international perspective, we have things like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005, which specifically highlighted the role of ecosystem services and the importance for management. right? And there's also lots of broader things that ecosystem services and recognition of values can help us with. More broadly, for wearing my economist hat, when we're thinking about the costs and benefits of different actions, whatever they might be, it allows us to incorporate the non-market benefits of economic stewardship. So it helps us dispel the economy versus environment myth, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard. Oh, gee, we'd like to conserve the environment, but oh, we can't ignore economic benefits, as if the two are polar opposites. In fact, they often move in lockstep. But if you ignore ecosystem service benefits, you ignore that fact and you lose it. Right? These, from a broader perspective, helps clarify trade-offs. Right? When economists think of values, it's just how people benefit. Right? Benefits or values in economics are just an improvement in people's well-being. We just happen to measure these often in dollar terms because dollars are a convenient measure, a medium of exchange, right? But there's nothing magic about dollars. We could quantify ecosystem service values in heads of cattle if we wanted to, right? And if we were in Botswana, that might make sense. But here we use dollars. So there's nothing about a value that requires that dollars change hands, right? Absolutely nothing, right? And so with these valuation tools, we can help clarify the trade-offs, right? How do people benefit? How do people lose? And so we can balance these things out, right? Also can be important from advocacy actions. Getting people to recognize that it's not, again, the economy versus the environment, that people benefit from environmental stewardship in exactly a parallel way to the way they benefit from buying milk and cars. It's a similar sort of thing. And I've got a good example, which I can talk about later, about baby foxes in our backyard, but I don't have time for that right now. So today's examples, I'm going to give you two examples later, which are designed to illustrate not only about how we integrate natural and social sciences to try to get a handle on what these values are, but also these examples illustrate ways that ecosystem service values and ecosystem services directly influence policy or information on these things. And one other thing, it's not as if this is a direct lever, right? I mean, providing ecosystem information on ecosystem services and values is not going to magically create sustainability, right? It's not going to tell you exactly what to do. What it's going to do is provide another tool in the toolbox that enables you to get a richer perspective on how people benefit from both market production and stewardship of ecosystems. So, just as background, again, I apologize to the economists in the crowd for whom this is like, okay, yeah, seeing this again, right? So, just the way economists think about values, right? So at the top, total value, which is all the benefits that people receive from things. Now we can split that up into market values. These are benefits that we receive from buying televisions and milk and gasoline and all that stuff. And non-market values. These are the benefits we receive from everything we can't buy directly in markets. So going to the beach for recreation, catching fish, breathing clean air, drinking clean water out of my well, right? These are all things that I don't buy in markets, but that provide benefits to me. Watching our new baby den of kit foxes in our backyard, which gave me great, great pleasure this weekend, right? I can't buy that. I can't go to Walmart and buy den of baby foxes in my backyard, but I can't tell you, if I had a chance to buy that, I would have paid a huge amount for that, because my wife and I just spent all day Saturday just looking at these cute baby foxes. That's an example of a non-market benefit. So for both market and non-market benefits, we split that out into use benefits. A use benefit, a use value is just a benefit that we receive by some action, by using something, right? By driving a car, by watching baby foxes, by drinking water. A non-use benefit is anything that we can't link to an observable action. The classic example is an existence value. I value the continued existence of tigers in the wild. And if I had a chance, if I truly could buy, guaranteed tiger existence, I would do so, but I can't. But there's no action there. It's just I value this because they're there, right? Bequest values are, I value something because I want to pass it on to future generations. These are things that we can't easily link to a behavior that we can observe, but they're nonetheless real values. They're things that make us better off, and that if we could, if there were the Walmart for species preservation, and I mean, we can donate to the World Wildlife Fund, but that's different, right? That's like donating to something we don't know it's not the same as buying something, right? But if truly we could go and buy a guarantee that tigers would exist, I think a number of us probably would do that. And that's kind of what we're after with valuation, right? We can't see people buying these non-market ecosystem services often, but what we want to do is create models whereby we can figure out, trace back what that willingness to pay would be if we could do that. Use values we can also split out into consumptive and non-consumptive. Pretty obvious, right? Consumptive uses something up. I drink milk, it's gone. I cut down timber, it's gone. Non-consumptive, it's still there. I watch baby foxes, they're still there the next day. I don't use them up by watching. Right? Okay, so, complicated slide. But basically the point is that depending on what kind of values we're looking at, economists have developed different ways to measure them. Right? So if we're talking about market values, and the one key thing is when people think about economics, they tend to think about this box right here. They think that it's all just market, supply and demand. But if you look at a broader perspective, markets are only one teeny tiny aspect of what economists think about and what economists value. And so if you want to do that, well, that's kind of supply and demand and consumer surplus and all that stuff, right? But what we tend to focus more on in the ecosystem services literature is this other stuff, these non-market values. Revealed preference methods are methods where we look at people's behavior and we trace that behavior back to try to estimate a value. Classic example would be a recreation demand model, where we look at where people choose to recreate. People are often willing to travel further, spend more money to get to higher quality sites, and we can use that behavior in models to infer their values. Hedonic models, right? People are willing to pay more to live in an area with higher quality environmental resources. And by looking at what people are willing to pay for homes, both in areas with high quality natural resources and lower quality, we can use that in carefully developed models to infer the trade-offs that people are willing to make. And that's a key thing. A value is just a trade-off between two things. It's what you're willing to give up to get something else, and that reveals something about your internal value. Now, the one thing about these revealed preference methods, it's nice in that they're based on behavior, but because they're based on behavior, you can't measure values that don't have anything to do with observable behavior. So you lose these non-use values, and that's why we've developed stated preference methods. These are our survey-based methods, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And basically, these typically work by asking people, we ask them effectively voting situations, where we say, if you had a choice between two states of the world at different costs, how would you vote? Right? And that reveals those trade-offs. And I'll give you examples of both a revealed preference method and a stated preference method. All right? So, these things are difficult, right? Ecosystem valuation is way more difficult than a lot of people give it credit for, right? Because not only do you have to have precise and measurable estimates of the ecosystem services, you have to know how the biophysical realm changes, and that's all sorts of difficult to predict all on its own. But you also have to have theoretically comparable, consistent definitions of the value you're measuring, right? So now you have to predict what's going on in nature. You have to link that to somehow what's going on in people, right? And then you have to have valid empirical measures on both sides to measure these things, right? So you've got challenges on both sides. And the big problem is that without detailed and the hard work of integration, we tend to do either natural science with a little smear of social science on the outside, or vice versa. So, for example, ecosystem service research, if you look out there in the literature, most of it is dominated by one side or the other, with kind of cartoons on the other side, right? So economists but often, I'll point to the high-powered candidate at us, right? We often do these high-powered economic models with a little bit of cartoon ecology on the side, right? So we'll calculate a value for high biodiversity, right? Well, I don't know what high biodiversity is. And certainly if you go to an ecologist and ask what high biodiversity is, they'll say, well, I have no idea. But we've got people out there, I guarantee you, who have figured out the value of high biodiversity, even though ecologically it has no meaning, right? So that's not fake, that people have really done that. Ecologists, on the other hand, to point the cannon back, will often ignore fundamental concepts of economic values. So effectively, they've got very well-designed ecological models, and they pair it up with these cartoon values that are meaningless. And so in both cases, you have numbers, you have models, but the results are at best questionable, and at worst, entirely invalid. And so with ecosystem valuation, like all these things, you get what you pay for. It's hard work. You have to engage from the beginning to the end, but if you don't do it, you get kind of garbage in, garbage out. And in ecosystem services and natural capital valuation, it's particularly problematic or troublesome because a lot of the most frequently cited analysis, the classic one is Costanza et al. 1997, who tried to value all the natural capital in the world, right? The vast majority of economists would agree that these numbers are, well, either grossly misleading or largely meaningless, right? Right, and so here's one quote that I pulled up, Bamford et al. Right, another person has described this work as what was it, something like a gross underestimate of infinity or something like that. Anyway, Toman said that. Why is this a problem? Well, a lot of times, I've spoken to some of the ecologists who do this work who kind of ignore the economic foundations or overlook them. And the answer that they give is, well, it's okay because the ends justify the means. We need more conservation. So we need to show big values. And it's okay if they're totally wrong because it's for a good cause. Right? That's the answer that I've gotten. And of course, they're not going to say it out in public, but that's what I've been told. But the problem is, of course, that it's not all apple pie, right? I mean, that in order to get more conservation, we're giving up stuff on the other side. And if we have bad numbers, we're going to make bad decisions on those based on those bad numbers. So I believe that you have to have the science right first, or you risk making bad decisions. So some of the challenges. So when we think about ecosystem service values, they're going to vary according to a whole bunch of stuff, right? Obviously, they're going to vary depending on the properties, changes of ecosystems, right? How stressors affect these systems. But they're also going to vary according to a lot of things that it's sometimes hard to measure. How many people are benefiting from different services? Do values differ according to different types of people? Right? And that's going to depend on underlying preferences, what people value and how, but also the availability of substitutes and complements, right? I mean, you're going to value foxes probably more if you only have one den on your property than if you're overrun by foxes that are eating up all your species, like in Australia, where red foxes are an endangered species, right? So very different perspective. More foxes in Australia, a bad thing because they're wiping out wallabies. More foxes in Millville, Massachusetts, a good thing, all right? So you can have the same biophysical thing that can have an exact opposite value depending on where you are, right? And if you ignore the economics, you can come up with really bad decisions. If you were to take a value of a fox in Massachusetts and move it to Australia, you would get it exactly wrong, right? So that's an example of how bad information can, Scope, right? The more you have of something, often the less an additional unit is worth, diminishing marginal returns, and also scale and distance over what area is something happening, right? So it's often complicated to deal with these things. And so one of the crucial things is transparency in the methods and assumptions and data. And unfortunately, in ecosystem services evaluation, sometimes we're not as transparent as we could be. So, two examples that I want to show are showing just how the rubber hits the road. And so I'm going to give one example of a stated preference model and one example of a real preference model. Let's show, how does ecosystem valuation proceed? How does it link natural science data and social science data? And then what comes out at the other end. So this first example illustrates the use of choice modeling. It's a stated preference approach that I'm going to show you in a minute. to estimate non-market benefits specifically for cost-benefit analysis of Section 316 of the B of the U.S. Clean Water Act. Basically, this enables U.S. EPA to regulate cooling water intake, largely into electric power facilities, but also some other industrial facilities. Right? So what happens? Okay. So cooling water effects on fish. Basically, the idea is you've got a big power plant. You need to cool down that power plant. You draw in millions of gallons of cooling water through big pipes, and that draws in lots of little fish. Fish eggs, fish larvae, big fish. Either they get squashed on the screens, the filter screens. That's called impingement. I remember that because it's kind of like pinching the fish, except by pinching we mean squash and turn to jelly, right? So the big fish die on the screens. Little fish get drawn through the screens and get heated up and killed in the internal cooling water thing and kind of spit out on the other side. That's entrainment. I think of that kind of like a train going right through the little screens and into the cooling water where everybody gets boiled, right? By the way, I once talked about boiling fish in a policy thing discussing this in EPA, and I got my head ripped off. So one has to be careful about how one describes these things. Anyway, so choice models, what we're going to use to value these things, we have estimates of how these things would track through to commercial fisheries harvests, right, and things like that. And it turns out that the effect on commercial harvests are quite small. Most of the fish that would be protected by these regulations on cooling water are forage fish. They're things that benefit aquatic ecosystems and have indirect effects on commercial fisheries. But the primary benefits are on things that you might expect to have non-use benefits for: aquatic ecosystems, fish populations. And so for that reason, we developed a stated preference choice experiment to try to model these trade-offs. What would people be willing to pay for policies that would improve or would improve the performance of power plants with regard to this ecosystem disservice? So you can think about power plants as creating a disservice. Instead of producing young fish, they're taking young fish out of the system, right? So it's like an anti-recruitment in a sense. And the way choice modeling works is it mimics a public vote. And I'll show you an example in a minute. We allow people to choose across lots of different policies with different effects on the environment and different potential costs to their household. In this case, realized through increases in electric bills, right? And so we ask people effectively, well, would you be willing to pay for a policy that would increase your electric bill by a certain amount if this would reduce the ecosystem disservice caused by these cooling water withdrawals? Here's a simple example, a real simple one, of how a choice model like this might work. Imagine that this is the way it's like today, right? So you have, I've just called this ecosystem service X and ecosystem service Y, right? Just for a general thing. So just imagine something like, one of these could be, fish killed in power plants, whatever, right? So the status quo, you have some baseline level of these, and you're paying the same things that you pay now, right? So this is the way it is today. No change in what you pay, no change in ecosystem services. Let's imagine that you're considering some policy option A that doesn't change X, but gives you an increment to Y. So now instead of getting Y1, you're getting Y1 plus A, right? So you're getting an improvement, a measurable improvement in some ecosystem service. And let's imagine, just hypothetically, that would, in order to get that, you would have to pay $10 more in taxes. Now we ask, how would you vote? Well, if you choose option A, if truly that's what you would choose, if given a choice, if that really reflects your preferences, that tells us something, right? It tells us that A right here is worth at least $10 for you. Otherwise, you wouldn't choose it. If, on the other hand, you vote for the status quo, it tells us something else. It says that A is worth less than $10. Now imagine a whole bunch of these questions with different changes in X and Y and different costs, and what that enables you to do is hone in on exactly the trade-offs that people are willing to make if they had a choice, if truly they could go into a voting booth and vote for the policy they wanted, as long as people are telling you the truth, right? And we have ways to evaluate that. You can actually hone in on that trade-off. This is the kind of the fundamental basis of a choice model. Right? We already talked about that. right? So the benefits of 316B, primary benefit is a reduction in fish loss from impingement and entrainment. It turns out it's exceptionally difficult. We know well, not exactly, but we know very closely how many organisms are lost, right? We can actually count the number of fish eggs and fish that are killed in those, that are taken in those intake things. So we know that down to a fairly high degree of precision, right? The problem is, once you figure out how many of those fish eggs and larvae and other things are killed, how do you model what that's going to mean for fish populations out in the world? That's exceptionally difficult. And in that case, the noise overwhelms the signal. And so one of the big challenges here is, what we want to know is, is there a value simply for reducing this ecosystem disservice, this loss, this immediate kill-off of fish? And how is that linked or not linked to broader ecosystem effects? So what we want to do is pull apart those two things. Is there a value for reducing that initial mortality? And then is there a value for the resulting potential impacts on fish populations, on aquatic ecosystems? Because what we don't want to do is ask the naive question where we simply say, what would you be willing to pay to reduce this fish mortality? And then let people speculate about what that might mean for broader ecosystems, because they have no basis for doing that. And ecologists have a hard time modeling that. So we need to split that apart. All right? So what we do, and this went out under the masthead of EPA, took a long time to develop. Stated preference survey asked respondents to choose amongst policies that would reduce entrainment and impingement, or I&E for short, in cooling water intake structures. And these are specific options. For example, you can use fine mesh screens, you can use closed cycle cooling, and we know exactly what that would mean in terms of fish losses. So we can model that exactly based on experiments that have been done in power plants. Right? The modeled ecological effects include an immediate reduction in fish mortality. And one of the problems there is, again, how do people understand that, right? What's it mean to take in a whole bunch of fish eggs and larvae? How do you communicate that to people in a way they can understand? Well, it turns out that what we do is we ecologically model that in terms of age 1 equivalents. And what that means is for every million eggs that is killed, only so many of those would grow up to be fish of age 1. So what we do is we take all those and we tell people, we know that most of those eggs wouldn't survive anyway, but this is what it means in terms of the number of baby fish that would be left in that water body at the end of the day. So that's how we actually model that. Right? But that's just one of the many choices you have to make, and that's why transparency is so crucial, right? Because there's often a lot of stuff that's going on under the hood, and it's important to know what those things are. Other effects would be improvements in fish populations, both all fish, including forage fish and commercial fish, and also effects on broader ecological condition, right? And we measure that using an aquatic index of biotic integrity. And these linkages are all drawn through by, in this case, by EPA and by ecologists working for Abt Associates. And I'm not going to specifically talk about those because the fundamental thing we're going to focus on here is on the immediate mortality impacts. One thing I just want to say, and I talked about this at lunch, is, so do people care about this? Is this, okay, time? Is that, basically this process, we've been working on this since 2003, right? And so industry spent probably millions of dollars trying to fight these numbers and these estimates, right? So we've spent a lot of time on this. Right, so basically what we do in the survey is we go through, we inform people, what's the policy context, right? We teach, we inform them about how cooling water affects fish. We talk about the size of the impacts, what are the relative size of the impacts relative to the total population of most species. I'm going through this quickly, I apologize. We define the changes as we're measuring them, right? Number of fish saved, relative size of fish populations, relative condition of aquatic ecosystems, and again, these are all measured using specific ecological indicators. And then we give them a choice question, much like the simple example, where we give these both in, here we're giving them both in terms of percentage of fish saved that are now killed, and also in terms of number of age 1 equivalents. And these other ones where things are just measured relative, right? So in terms of commercial fish populations, these are defined relative to fish populations that would allow maximum sustainable harvest, right? So that's 100%. We tell them what that is, and then we tell them where we are. Notice these effects are quite small, right? Because they actually would be in real life. there are not hundreds, but dozens of questions like this that show different levels of effects for all these things and different costs. And by looking at how people vote for all those different ones, we can hone in the trade-offs that people are willing to make. Right? And so this is what we get at the end of the day. Just one simple example. Right? Right? So here we have different regions, right? Northeast region, southeast region, right? And so what we can do is these are willingness to pay or values per percentage point increase in each of those indicators. And this is the one I'm going to focus on, fish saved, because that's the one that we can measure with most precision. And basically what we find is about $1.32 per household for each percentage point gain. So it's not a lot for each percentage point gain, but you blow that up over a lot of different households, you get a big value, right? And the other thing you notice is that these numbers vary a lot depending on where you are, right? So in the Pacific, right, a lot higher value, right, greater environmental motivations there, compared to inland where we have much lower. And it turns out that EPA's benefit cost analysis just used these fish saved numbers because they didn't feel secure enough about the other projections in terms of fish populations. But what this allows us to do, industry was arguing that really the only thing that people care about are populations, right? And so they were arguing very strenuously that we shouldn't be we shouldn't be including these fish saved at all, because they said once we showed that these fish populations weren't changing very much, that there wouldn't be any values for reducing fish mortality in these plants anyway. So they said you shouldn't be doing this because it's going to be zero. And what we were able to show is that no, in fact, even after you've pulled out these effects on aquatic ecosystems and fish populations, that we still have a value people are willing to pay just to reduce that large loss of fish in cooling water intake structures. Right? So this is actually right now it's going into the benefit cost analysis. It's actually going to influence what EPA is going to do, right? And so right now there's a lot of dialogue, and industry still doesn't want this to they're still fighting going in. And by the way, I should say that this is kind of my private opinion. It's not the official line or official statement of U.S. EPA. I'm simply describing the models that we ran to go into this. But okay. Last thing I want to do, and I'm going to have to go through this quickly, is to show just another example. And this is related to the recreational services provided by Delaware Bay beaches, right? So, Delaware Bay beaches, right? These are not the big ocean beaches. These are small beaches in Delaware Bay. They are getting narrower and narrower each year due to natural erosion, due to sea level rise, due to storms. And the state is getting tired of spending lots and lots of money to re-nourish these beaches and widen them. And so the state wanted to know, well, what are the benefits of beach width, right? So what are the benefits of having a wider beach versus a narrower beach, and what are the effects, for example, if we were to allow different types of retreat? So they're thinking about, for example, pulling out houses and allowing the beach to naturally migrate as it would. And what they wanted to know was, well, what are the human effects of this, right? And so the part that I'm going to talk about is recreational benefits, right? So these are actual policies that are now being considered, and we did this under a contract from the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. This is where the beaches are. This is Delaware Bay. Right? These are the beaches that we're dealing with, right? So this is a projection, and this is what these beaches look like, right? So you can see what's going on here, right? So we got a narrow little spit of land. Water coming in, the beach is very narrow. That's a picture of this beach, right? And this is what's behind it, right? So not a whole lot of room here, right? When those beaches narrow, these houses are gone and pretty much, right? So it's just pretty relevant, right? So the other benefits are the housing benefits, which I'm not going to talk about today. But you can see just from this picture that it's a pretty important issue. We're not talking about a mile-wide beach. We're talking about a beach that's 10 or 20 feet and narrowing down each year. Right? So, what we do is we start with biophysical data that said, and this was provided by engineers at a company that we worked with, under 4 different management scenarios. Scenario 1, you nourish the beach. I'll show you these in a minute. Scenario 2, you manage the retreat. Scenario 3 is basic retreat. Scenario 4 is do nothing. Here's what they are. Beach nourishment. Here's where the beach is now. You get a bunch of sand and you build out the width, right? So you nourish it. You make the beach wider, and then you keep nourishing it to keep that wider width. From now, we projected this out for 40 years. Enhanced retreat, what you do is you want the same width as the nourished beach, but you don't go forward to get it, you go backward to get it. And how do you go backward? You pull out these houses, right? So under enhanced retreat, you remove a lot of houses to expand the beach backward. You force a landward retreat, and then you allow the whole beach to retreat naturally, right, once you've done that. Right, so the big thing there is you get a wide beach, but you rip out a lot of houses to do that. So that's a pretty big trade-off. Right, basic retreat, same idea, but instead of widening the beach, it's a lesser beach width. Right, so you just keep the current average width, and then you let that narrower width go back. So you get a narrower beach, naturally retreating, and you remove houses as it goes. So you lose fewer houses, but you get less width. And then the last one is do nothing. Do nothing is what it sounds like. Do nothing. You don't nourish. The beach gradually retreats. As it goes back, these houses go bye-bye. They fall in the water. You leave the homeowners on their own. And then ultimately this water meets that water and there's no beach. Right? So that's what it looks like. Some pretty important trade-offs here. Right? And what we're looking at is what does that mean for recreational benefits, the people who use the beach for recreation. Right? So a couple steps, again, going through. First, you got to figure out what's going to happen to the beach width, right? So here, So here's where we are today, right? So we know. So these are the points that were modeled, and we link those up through just a nice little interpolation, right? So we know what's going to happen to width, or we can predict that out based on our engineering models. Then we have to say, well, what does beach width mean for benefits? Right? So to do that, we take a model that George Parsons did in coordination with the same project, a contingent behavior model for valuing beach width. Basically, this is a whole big fancy model, but basically what he does is he looks at what beaches people are going to now based on current width, right? Uses a recreation demand model to figure out how much people are willing to pay to travel to these beaches at their current width. Then he intercepts those people and says, okay, what if this beach was 25% of its current width? How many trips do you anticipate that you would take? Right? So it's mixing observed behavior and stated behavior, right? What people are actually doing with what they say they would do. Also asks for 200% of current width. And based on that, he's able to get a function of value at different widths. And so basically what we did is, we using Parsons' model, what we can do is take, for all these different beaches, we can look at behavior of non-owners, and by non-owners, it's non-owners of beachfront homes, and owners of homes in these communities, and we aggregate out those values. So basically, this is the annual values for different types of trips, for day trips, for short overnight trips, and for overnight trips. And the overnight trips are particularly important because those are the ones that you lose when you lose houses. If you lose houses, there's no place for the overnight people to stay, right? And so that's something we have to account for. We can also then say, okay, well, how would these change if the beach dropped to 25% of its current width? And again, this is based on Parsons' model. So from this initial 118,000 day values, day trips to Bowers, we lose about 17,000 of it, right, at 25% of the width. Okay, so that allows us to sketch out this nice little function. And interestingly, here, we see that this is the way we are today at current value, right, 0. We gain a little bit if we double the beach width. We lose a little bit if we get to a quarter, and then we drop off sharply because we somehow have to get down here to 0, right? Because if there's no beach, there's no recreation by definition, right? So that's why we have this little steep thing, right? And so we have basically 3 observable points and 4 points that's kind of, well, not tautological, but by definition you can't have recreation on a beach which doesn't exist, right? So we line those up. Right? We also have a prediction of how many houses will be lost because we know where the houses are. If we know where the beach moves, we know how many houses will fall in the water. Right? And so we have these points and then we link them up. This isn't exactly linear, but it's close. Right? And that's kind of what it looks like. So the integrated model, right? So we have predicted widths. We have a recreation demand model that forecasts value as a function of width. Right? So we link those up. And then combined by that, we have a loss of houses. And this is an assumption we had to make, right? So this predicts value changes, recreational value changes, assuming that there's the number of houses don't change. But we know that the houses are going to fall in the water, some of them. So what we do is we reduce all overnight trips in proportion to the decline in standing houses. And that's a pretty strong assumption. Basically, we're assuming if you lose half your houses, you've lost half the places where people stay, you lose half your overnight trips, is what we've assumed. All right, so you sum them over time, and this is what you get. I mean, this is basically kind of, and there's a lot of numbers and blah, blah, blah. But the key thing I want to show you is that we get very different values aggregated depending on what you do. Right? And so now what you can do is say, well, here's the recreational benefit if you do nothing, a huge loss, but that also costs the state nothing to do, right? Nourishment is much more high. By the way, these numbers are relative to a baseline of keeping a hypothetical baseline of keeping the current width from now until forever, right? Right? The other thing, even more relevant, is the differences between beaches, right? So here, the aggregate benefits or losses of strategic retreat and basic retreat are the same. So you might look at that and say, oh, it doesn't matter, except look how different it is across different beaches. So here you have a gain at Bowers Beach for strategic retreat and a loss under basic retreat. That reverses at Slaughter Beach. Right, so it's not just an aggregate. It's where are things lost, right? So with nourishment, recreational benefits increase because you got wider beach, but it costs a lot of money to get there. Strategic retreat, your benefits increase due to beach width increases, but decrease because you're losing so many houses, so there's nowhere for people to stay. Basic retreat, same thing, but at a smaller scale, right? And with no action, you get benefit decreasing due to width and housing losses. Right? So what you can do is, it's not just a matter of saying, are there values and are they big? We can start to really tailor it to specific actions and say, if you do this action, these are the people who are going to lose, this is where they live, and you can really start to look at specific trade-offs. That's the power of ecosystem services. It's not just saying, oh, look, it's $12 million. It's really targeting it down to the policy level. Right? So here, and again, I apologize I had to go through it quickly, demonstrates how recreational benefits can respond to erosion and retreat options, right? So we see offsetting things, right? Wider beaches that you may allow for through landward retreat increase benefits, but in order to do that, you're removing houses, which decrease benefits because now there's no one living there. So it enables trade-offs, valuation of trade-offs under different policies, heterogeneous effects across different groups like owners and non-owners. And again, these numbers are directly now in front of Delaware legislators who are figuring out what to do with this, right? So it's not telling them what to do, but it's providing information to help them make a more informed choice, right? So final comments. So these examples, again, the point is not to go into all the nitty-gritty details, but just to show how you can combine economic and ecological data for relevant ecosystem service valuation. To emphasize that both these projects directly inform policy. These weren't just economic journal things. These directly inserted into the policy process. Both involved extensive, they involved extensive involvement of natural and social sciences from the beginning. And that's a crucial thing. This wasn't something where economists did a bunch of things and then brought in ecologists at the 11th hour and said, oh, we need some ecology, or vice versa. This was something that from the inception of the project, we had natural and social sciences at the table. Also, you've noticed that there were a lot of assumptions, and if we had more time, I could tell you about even more assumptions involved in both these, right? Some of the assumptions are relatively heroic. Right now, current applications, we're really stretching our existing methods to their limits. It's not as if we figured out how to do everything, right? So every year we're developing these methods, and so not only does that emphasize that that we haven't gotten everything perfect yet, but transparency is crucial, right? You have to look under the hood. Beware of these kind of ambiguous descriptions of data or methods, or these kind of decision support tools where you go on the web and key in a few numbers and you get a nice GIS map of ecosystem service values. Buyer beware, right? The way that where those numbers come from really matters. And these large-scale ecosystem service models, a lot of times they're making, assumptions that make, my heroic assumptions look like little baby foxes, right? And so you really have to ask where the numbers come from. It's crucial. It's not just about saying, oh, these are big numbers, because as you saw in the Delaware Bay example, there can be really differential effects across different groups. And the last thing, just if you care, here's just a list. I could give you even more stuff, but here's just some further readings in different areas that you might look to. And if you're interested in this, I can give you lots more. But Kathleen asked me to put up a list of readings, so there, I've done it. So I apologize for speaking so quickly, but I wanted to leave at least a little bit of time for questions. Thanks. Yeah.
You mentioned the Delaware legislature, and it reminds me of the statement, there are no wrong decisions, or just different pathways. And I mentioned that just because I'm wondering about how boundary conditions affect the analysis. And one example I'll give is that on the beach front, one calculation that I didn't see in there that I wonder how it would affect things was a lot of times the Corps of Engineers or a local government will look for a disposal site for dredging projects. And no matter what, if they find a cheap disposal site, if it's sand, they'll throw it on the beach. They would love that, and it might offset the cost of having to contain it. So if that's not in there, I'm just wondering how everything cascades out from that analysis that you did, and all those other factors, and how far you take it down the road.
This was one part of a huge research project, and in fact, part of that research project was dealing with exactly that, which is where the sand comes from. Dealing with with the reduced disposal cost elsewhere. It turns out that in this case, it's not an issue. I mean, they have to go out and get the sand because the nearby dredging is dredging sediment that's not suitable for beaches. But that's a crucial issue, and it is in fact a discussion that we had. So definitely that's a great point. This is one very small part of a project that had to deal with a lot of things, right? So we looked at effects on horseshoe crab nesting and on costs borne by homeowners who might be trying to protect their homes and all sorts of things. And so that would have taken me all day to talk about. And I wasn't honestly involved in all of it. So you're right. There's all sorts of things. And what we do is we just try to present all those in one place, present them in a concise, mainstream way, and then give them to the policymakers, help them understand what they are. And then it's largely up to the policymakers to, at a certain point, a decision has to be made, and there's a subjective element to that. We just try to inform that as well as we can. In the back.
So in your disciplinary thought, how do you see climate change affecting this process, specifically as climates become more erratic? Do you think that resource economists are going to be able to communicate well enough with people that are developing new models of, because the erosion rate, for instance, in 10 years may be wildly different?
Yeah. Right. That's a great question, and it's an excellent challenge, and it touches on all sorts of things, but primarily on our ability to predict the future and the fact that the models that we may have used in the past might not work. Right now, it's that this is something that economists are really, economists have known about uncertainty for a long time. We also know that we don't deal with it as well in some cases as we should. But it is something that we're now starting to take on head on. And in fact, we've got a project right now. I've got a project right now in Connecticut that's looking at exactly those issues with regard to coastal adaptation. Given that there's great uncertainty in our forecasts, how do you make decisions? And specifically, we're trying to figure out how these values vary when you make that uncertainty explicit, right? And how people incorporate that in terms of their own decisions, for example, in terms of, when they're deciding where to buy a home, but also in terms of how they might, what kind of policies they would support or not support. And it's challenging because one of the big challenges is first modeling what's going to happen. What's your probability distribution, or even do you have any idea what that is? But then secondly, how do you communicate that in a meaningful way? Because you're looking out into the future, right? There's all sorts of, there's sea level rise, there's storminess, so many different things. And how do you communicate that to policymakers and people? And so the short answer is we're working on it. And so it's something we're very much aware of, and that's one of those cases where we're stretching things to their limits right now. Yeah.
I guess this is another question about uncertainty, but I wonder about, you made a comment earlier about how what you quantify with dollars or head of cattle doesn't actually matter, but by putting in dollars, we're making the assumption that today's relative values are equivalent to future relative values, whereas scarcity of the beach may be different in the future. So if you ask somebody how much extra would you pay to have this beach, or how much is it worth to recreate here, that is contingent upon how much is currently available. But if they
Right.
only had one beach to choose from in the future, those numbers would be wildly different. And these are very long-term decisions, but they're all based on relative values
And
today.
there's a couple things there. The fundamental issue, we can account for, right? In that if you've done your valuation correctly, you should be accounting for these future changes at least as much as you can predict them, right? So if you're talking about the value of a beach, and you're trying to predict into the future, well, you want to make that value prediction contingent upon the way things will be in the future. So that should be built in. Now, is it always built in? Not always, but conceptually, that's the way it should be done. So then you get down to the empirical question: is can you predict accurately enough? But it's well known. But economists, that it's well known that, for example, that the benefits of beach width are going to depend on where you start, right? And that's standard stuff. So then it just gets down to the empirical question of, do we know enough about the future? Now, that's not to say that there aren't some bad models out there that ignore that. And there are a lot of ecosystem service models out there that do ignore that. But we know that value should be sensitive to that, and we have methods to do that. There are other issues about intertemporal balancing. For example, do you discount the future or don't you discount the future? So it's not to minimize the importance of this. One of the crucial things is how we compare future and cost. But there's the theoretical issue, and the theoretical issue, with the exception of do you discount or not, that's not particularly controversial. What's often harder is taking that theory and turning it into an empirical estimate that you can really estimate. So it's a good question.
Increasingly, I find in the community an upset with the term ecosystem services. Because what you're really describing are environmental services or nature services.
Yeah.
And somehow you've given the ecologists a lot more credit than they deserve. And I noticed that I didn't hear mention of any ecologists. You had engineers, you had different kinds of people doing your supportive analysis on the so-called science side.
Right.
But there weren't any.
Well, there
You
were
may have had
ecologists,
some,
Right.
But the point is that I think we ought to try to move away to something called environmental services or nature services.
For that, you could practically be an honorary economist, because the funny thing is, economists actually don't particularly like the term ecosystem services. We prefer things like non-market values or environmental values. It's just that ecosystem services have now gained so much resonance with the policy process that basically what we're doing now is that and there are differences. I mean, ecosystem services at least ideally focus more on ecosystems, but people lump things like ozone protection, atmosphere under ecosystem services. Yeah, you're right. I agree with you. To a certain extent, it's a communication thing. And you're also right that I don't have ecologists up here. And in an ideal world, I would have the ecologists from APT talking through the fisheries models that they did. And so even in this case where I'm talking about integration, I'm not qualified to talk about the ecological models, which is why I'm not. Basically what I do is I work with the ecologists. I get to the point where I can understand the outputs and use them. But if you were to ask me to go through the details of the fisheries models they ran, I would be like, no, I rely on them. And so definitely ongoing challenges. Yeah.
So, I work in this area a bit, and so normally when you use these type of models, you're looking for a market failure.
Mm-hmm.
And in the beach example, I have to say I don't see any market failure in the sense that 100% of these benefits are capturable by charging entrance fees to the beach and or by housing. I mean, why should the government be involved whatsoever in this? It seems to me that this is, I understand the technique, but it's like, I don't see the
Well,
problem.
that's a good. Well, it's a good question, but the real problem here, and the reason we did this analysis is exceptionally important and exceptionally real, and that is the government has been spending money to nourish these beaches for about the past 70 years.
So it's just a transfer, right? It's just, you're just giving one piece of
Yeah,
people.
to a certain extent,
So
there
just-
is right.
just
We're
like your
this
government
this
can-
was not. I mean, economic analysis doesn't always have to be about fixing market failures. In our textbooks, yeah, that's what we're about, right? But this was done to, and this is why I emphasize, this was about evaluating trade-offs, right? This was about looking at gains and losses to different groups. So the focus wasn't on whether there was a market failure in need of fixing. We're not trying to identify an optimum here. What we're doing is trying to see who gains and who loses if the state decides to either continue nourishing. I mean, so basically we had 4 policy options on the table. The state is going to do one of them. And the state asked us who's going to gain, who's going to lose, because they wanted to know which one of these policies would be the most beneficial. But they also wanted to be able to answer when these homeowners showed up on at the Capitol and screamed and said, "You're pulling up my house. You're letting my house fall into the water." So that's one of these things that I kind of jump up and down, and kind of as economists, we tend to focus on kind of solely on market failures because that's what we do. But in many cases, the policymaker is not. I mean, they don't even know what a market failure is. They want to be able to say, okay, here I'm trying to make this choice. Give me information. So in some case, I don't know what that answers your question, but that's the motivation for
Yeah,
this.
fair enough. I mean, why not just, but I mean, the other policy option is just let people charge and pay a fee.
Well,
and
in
there's
theory,
a-
you
test
could
it.
do that, except that logistically, that's not allowed. I mean, that's not allowed in these cases, right? So there's no mechanism. I mean, in a perfect world, sure, you could wall off these beaches, but the way these beaches actually are, there are homes that are on the beaches. Most of the people recreating there are either owners or people who are visiting the owners, and because of property rights, you can't. I mean, the way they are now, I mean, if you change the laws, I suppose, you can't just wall off those homeowners and charge them. So in theory, certainly, yeah, you could do that. You could create markets, but in this particular policy context, that wasn't on the table. And so really, we were basically saying, here's the situation we're facing. Given that situation, what are the trade-offs here? And certainly, if you wanted to take one more step back, yeah, you could talk about, you could capitalize those values. You're absolutely right. Some of them, like horseshoe crabs, you probably couldn't, but yeah. Yeah.
So in these 2 cases you gave us, can you give us a sense of the cost of the information?
In the Delaware case, I don't know the cost of the entire study. The cost of the work that I did, I'd have to think, but basically it was in the range of, I don't know, $70,000, something like that.
But you
for this
relied
work.
on that recreation demand model, so that was necessary.
What's that? Yeah, and so the underlying record. I mean, so that was like 25,000. I mean, George did that on a shoestring, I think. But the EPA study, that was exceptionally expensive. I mean, I don't know what the overall budget is, but given that the overall effort started in 2003, I mean, a lot of that was just because of the process. Going through the federal approvals process was ridiculously time consuming. I mean, if you've never gone through OMB review, it's a particular joy that I would encourage you to go through. I mean, here, so for example, we received over 700 pages of official public comments, and EPA, and by EPA, me and us, had to respond to every single one of those public comments in some way, shape, or form. Right? We generate our focus groups interviews generated. It's more than this now. Close to 2,000 pages of documentation. I mean, a huge effort to prove and demonstrate that this was a valid approach to go through. So I don't know how much EPA spent on this, But it wasn't cheap. And that actually raises another question: is doing these models right is expensive, and so it gets to the question of when are you spending more to study it than the underlying thing is actually worth? And that's a whole other ball of wax and discussion we could have about, when should you be using cheaper approximations that will get you close enough instead of spending $500,000 to study something to death. So that's an important issue. Yes.
Just a minor comment and question about your 4 scenarios.
Yeah.
Do you think that giving specific names influences the policies?
What we did, remember, this isn't. Sorry.
Finish. So, calling it scenario A, B, C, and D versus a strategic or objective data.
This wasn't a survey, right? These were just labels we used internally for the study. So the study was just based on, so for example, in George's study, he went in and he counted people on the beach. And then he asked them, where did you come from? Where do you live? How much do you spend? And then he asked them, how much, okay, so how many times did you come this season? How many times do you think you'd come to this beach if it were 25% of its current width? And he'd say what that would mean is that the beach would come to here instead of out to here. So in George's study, and in any, no one ever saw the name beach nourishment. So those were just labels I used so that you guys could understand what we were talking about.
But what I was asking is that then handed forward to the policy?
The policymakers gave us these names.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So the policymakers came to us and said, we've got 4 policy options. One of them is called beach nourishment, one of them is called strategic or tree, and this is what they are. So those were handed to us, and that's what we valued. We didn't come up with any of the names. Our engineers here did this modeling, but the underlying description of what the state would do was given to us. But that's an excellent point. If we had been doing a survey or something like that, the names that we put on things could be crucially important. And so that would be something, you definitely want to evaluate. So that's a good point. Yeah.
I want to get back to the point before Shuleen's question about we can't afford to do these studies for everything, and yet a lot of us who are sort of in public service or are certainly funded with government funds to do our research have to report economic, are expected now to report economic
Yeah,
impact.
we could talk about that in Seagram.
So how do you see, what are your suggestions for the future, knowing that we can't afford this research, we don't have the capacity for it, really? So, and yet people want the information, but we have to make decisions because we're running out of time. So where should this be going?
That's an excellent question, and we could spend all day talking about it. But there's a couple points I can make quickly. The first is there's a lot of work right now, and this is the other area that I work in a lot, in what we call benefit transfer, which is where you take existing information where you got it and move it over to where you need it. And there's a lot of work on that, on how accurate it is and when it's likely to provide low error information, what kind of errors to expect, when it's appropriate, when it's not. So there's a lot of work on that, and I'm actually right now in the middle of editing a handbook on exactly that to pull together this information. So it's a very hot field. Problem is that it's often misused, right? It's often done poorly, where people just kind of blindly grab a number from a master's study that was done in 1984, and they take that number and move it over here. Or even, I was talking at lunch about people who will do a study in the scientific literature and say, don't use this for policy. This is just done to estimate, to show this fancy new estimator. And so they'll say, this is a number, but this isn't real. Don't use it. And then someone will take that number and they'll use it for policy. And I see that all the time. That notwithstanding, there are ways that you can approximate values, and it depends on what level of accuracy is needed for your application, right? Do you just need something that shows that there's a value? Are you making specific trade-offs? And so there's a lot of stuff there, and there's a lot of things that economists can say about that. The second thing I'll say, though, and this is specific in the case of Seagram, because I was in Sea Grant and was asked to provide those numbers for many years. And I argued with the Sea Grant people saying, you are asking for results that cannot be predicted and are largely meaningless, right? So for example, if you've got a guy trying to study the effect of larval dispersal on a particular type of flounder, right? And then you ask him, how many jobs are going to be created as a result of your research? How much income, right? Well, even as an economist, I mean, we would look at that and go, that's ridiculous. We had a really hard time even starting to think about that. But now you're asking, a fish biologist to do it, right? So I think in a lot of cases, we as a society, as legislatures, whatever, are asking people to provide economic information that they're in no condition to provide with any level of accuracy. And that's something that I think as economists we also need to do a better job of, is educating the public about when these numbers are useful versus when you're just throwing out meaningless gibberish.
Okay, I know that some people have to leave, so I do want us to take the time to thank Rob.